So, why exactly are you taking this course? Let's see what sort of learner you are, what sort of student you are, what your aim is here. The Master said, "Those who are born with knowledge are the highest class of people. Those who don't know, but are eager to learn, are the next. Those who have no knowledge and yet refuse to learn, well, they're the lowest." The Master said, "He who learns but does not think is lost. He who thinks but does not learn is in great danger." The Master said, "Shall I teach you what knowledge is? When you know a thing, to recognize that you know it, and when you do not know a thing, to recognize that you do not know it. That's knowledge." The Master said, "In ancient times, people learned with a view to their own improvement. Nowadays, they learn with a view to the approbation of others." And the Master also said, "I do not open up the truth to someone who is not eager for knowledge. When I have presented one corner of a subject to someone, and he cannot from this learn the other three, I do not repeat my lesson." Well, who is this mysterious master? As you know from your reading in Paths of Return, it's the great Master Kung, Confucius, or in the pronunciation that developed in Europe, Confucius. And the book from which I've been quoting here is his famous Analects. The Analects are aphorisms, short sayings of Confucius put together by his disciples. Here, by the way, is what it would look like in Chinese. Here's a couple of pages from the Analects. Chinese, by the way, is read from top to bottom and from right to left. So down the right column, down the next column, and you discover these truths, these aphorisms. But I'm getting ahead of myself here a bit. Let's back up and get a running start before we say more about the great master and his teaching. When we were together last, we undertook a journey, traveling from India to China along the route taken by Buddhist missionaries in the 1st century AD. And in doing so, we moved from the first of our families of religion to the second, from South to East Asia. Today is the first of 2 sessions in which we'll be talking about 2 other religions, 2 indigenous Chinese religions, which those missionaries encountered when they arrived. Here's yet a different sort of map, different depiction of the distribution of religions than we've looked at before. As you can see, it's color-coded to show which religions are the predominant religions of the world. Christianity, as we've mentioned before, is at the top. All the purple of the world is predominantly Christian. Islam in the green comes second. Well, this key also mentions Judaism. We'll talk about Judaism a little bit later. It's really the tiniest religion of all, demographically speaking. Then comes Hinduism, 3rd largest, red, subcontinent of India. Then Buddhism, which we talked about last time, sort of a light tan there in China. And then what this legend simply calls the Chinese religions, the darker brown over here at the east side of the Chinese mainland, the Asian continent, Chinese religions. Here are some stats. The Chinese religions indeed are the 5th largest in terms of their adherents worldwide, about 394 million followers, 6% of the world's population. Cultures, countries strongly influenced by the Chinese traditions include not just China, mainland China, but also Taiwan, Korea, and then also various territories settled predominantly by the Chinese, such as Singapore. Japan is also indirectly influenced by these ancient Chinese religions. Let's back up a second here just to show you. So here we've got the Chinese mainland. Down here, this little island next to my cursor, that's Taiwan. Up here is Korea, the Korean peninsula. And then over here, of course, is Japan. So those countries would all be in some way influenced by the Chinese, what we're calling here the Chinese religions. Now, of course, that way of putting it, speaking of religions in the plural or two different indigenous traditions, as I just did a moment ago, is a little misleading. As you know from your reading, there's an important sense in which the two are really parts of a single tradition. And of course, the two that we're speaking of here are Confucianism and the tradition that we'll talk about next time, Daoism. The question I pose here, Chinese tradition, Chinese traditions, singular or plural. Well, you can look at it both ways. Scholars have looked at it both ways. They've talked about two religions, distinct from each other, but then also as two parts of a puzzle. And that's what my imagery is designed to remind you of, two different pieces of a single puzzle. Confucianism, the exoteric, the outer part of the puzzle, and Daoism, the esoteric or the inner part of that puzzle. The exoteric outer Chinese religious life, the esoteric, the inner Chinese religious life. Also here, I'm going back to something I said last time when we talked about Buddhism. I mentioned that there's a distinction to be made in the Eightfold Path, the Noble Eightfold Path, between steps on the path that are primarily concerned with ethics and virtue and the moral life, and those that are concerned with meditation, contemplation, the contemplative life. And remember, I gave you a quotation in that context from the Christian medieval theologian St. Thomas Aquinas, who said really the two work together, right? The active life, how we interact with other people in a moral or ethical way, impacts our meditative, contemplative life, our contemplation, meditation, and vice versa. So that's what I'm trying to illustrate here and trying to resonate here with the ideas last time. Confucianism, Daoism, in a sense, can represent these two puzzle parts, these two sides of one coin, two hands, as it were, clasping each other, one active and then one contemplative. Anyway, back to our master, back to Confucius, Kung Fu Tzu, the great master Kung. Confucianism, pretty obviously, like Christianity, is a religion named after its founder. Christianity, named after Christ. The Messiah, Christos, is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Messiah. Christians believe Jesus, in fact, is that promised Messiah. And in the case of Confucianism, Confucius, the Western European pronunciation of Kung Fu Tzu, going back to this master who lived 6th century, 5th century BC, 551 to 479 BC. What exactly was he a master of? Well, again, as you know from your reading, practically everything. Archery, charioteering, how to drive a chariot, calligraphy, beautiful handwriting, social etiquette, mathematics, poetry, history, music, among other things. A polymath, we would call him, I suppose, someone who had knowledge of virtually everything. I referred to him as a one-man university. Someone who taught, apparently, as did the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates, by asking questions, not by propounding, not by professing, not primarily by giving lectures, as I'm doing right here, but by probingly asking people deep questions that would elicit their understanding, which he would then apparently correct and refine in his dialogue with them. Confucius called himself a traditionalist. Well, he didn't use that English word, obviously, but that's what it came to. And as I say here, a traditionalist is someone who hands on or transmits something which someone else has given them, from the Latin word tradere. Here's the quotation I have in mind when I say that, again from the Analects. Confucius says, "I have transmitted what was taught to me, without making up anything of my own. I've been faithful to and have loved the ancients. I've listened in silence and noted what was said. I've never grown tired of learning, nor wearied of teaching others what I have learned." Now I contrast that here on the slide, traditionalist or a traditionalist person who hands everything on, to a revealer. I said here versus revealers. Other founders of other religions, unlike Confucius, did, well, you can't say they made things up, but they didn't simply study what other people before them had said and then pass that on to their contemporaries and successors. Beings like, I should say, Krishna, who's an avatara of Vishnu, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, Jesus, the incarnate Son of God, Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. In each case, these beings brought things, as it were, directly from God, from heaven. Krishna comes down as an avatar, Jesus comes down as Son of God. Siddhartha, now remember, the Buddha, was not the first Buddha that ever existed. There were other Buddhas, but he didn't consult with them. He didn't go back and read what they'd written. He, as it were, downloaded directly from the ultimate, from the ultimate state of reality, the truth about that in his Four Noble Truths. And Muhammad didn't study other people's writings. In fact, he was illiterate, but he was given a message directly from Allah. So revealers in contrast to Confucius, the traditionalist. This is another aspect in which Confucius, his teaching, his personality was so understated. He wanted to make sure people didn't single him out as some kind of special being. No, all he was someone who was faithful to other people's teaching, and he transmitted that faithfully so far as he could. Confucius's focus, as you know from your reading, like that of other East Asian religious teachers, was on the problem of society. And I'm reminding you here, we have categorized and divided the geographical, historical religions, Southeast Asia and then the West, in terms of the problems of life, the philosophical problems they tended to specialize in. So South Asian religions, we talked about their focus on self. We'll be talking a bit later about the Western religions, Islam, Judaism, and how they focus on nature. But now, here with Confucius, and then also next time with the Daoists, the focus is society, an attempt to answer questions like, who is my neighbor? How am I supposed to relate to that neighbor, other people? What is the ideal form of society? Very much right at the heart and center of Confucius's teaching. That teaching, a Confucianist, a Confucian himself or herself, would refer to, not as Confucianism, but as Li Jiao. Li Jiao, upper left-hand corner of this slide, Li Jiao. Jiao is a Chinese word which means something like doctrine. It can mean education. It can mean teaching. It could mean religion. So some people translate Li Jiao as the religion of Li. All of, however you put it, focused on this very, very important Confucian concept of Li, L-I. As I've explained, Li has both a horizontal or natural, green in my coloring scheme here, dimension to it, and it also has a supernatural, vertical, a blue dimension to it. On the one hand, it has to do with comportment and manners and social etiquette, but on the other hand, it also has the dimension which a Christian or someone in the West, a Hindu too, would describe as having a ritual aspect or a sacramental aspect, insofar as how we act resonates with ultimate cosmic patterns and dimensions and proportions that are up there and out there in the universe itself. Here are some examples. I'm going to give you some examples of proper Confucian comportment, and I've put in parentheses here the word sacramental, again to underscore the fact that these aren't simply how we act socially, but these are understood to have very important implications for our relation with the ultimate, our relation with heaven. In going to take counsel with an elder, so when you're going to go ask for some advice from somebody older than you should carry a stool and a staff for the elder's use. You shouldn't make them stand up while they're answering your question. And when the elder asks you a question, you should decline to answer if at all possible, or if an answer is necessary, you should acknowledge your incompetence. I like that, before saying anything else. I'm really in no position to say, sir. I'm really just, kind of a dumb person, ma'am. It's not for me to say, but if you want me to say, I might say something like this. Second one, a son should not occupy the southwest corner of an apartment. Apparently, in Chinese understanding of things, the southwest is the best place to be. Nor should you sit in the middle of the mat, nor walk in the middle of the road, nor stand in the middle of the doorway. So in other words, don't hog What's best? Stay to one side, deflect and defer. Don't put yourself up front. Similarly, a young boy should stand straight and square and not sort of droop his head or incline his head like he's bored when he's listening. Whenever a host has received and is entering into his house with a guest, so you've got company, you're the host, somebody's come over, well, at every door he should give place to the guest. When the guest arrives at the innermost door, the host will ask to be allowed to enter first and arrange the mats. Now, if you're a traditional Chinese person, Japanese as far as that goes as well, you don't have a table and chairs, you eat on the floor. And you have a cushion to sit on, and then your dishes, your plates and so forth, the things that you're eating from are put on top of a mat on the floor, a beautiful mat. Having done this, the host will come out and then receive the guest, who will firmly refuse to enter first. The host having made a low bow, they will enter together. The host moves to the right, the guest to the left. They offer each other precedence in going upstairs. You go first. Oh, no, you go first. No, you go first. So again, humility, deferment, deflection, not putting yourself on top. Male and female should not sit together, nor have the same stand or rack for their clothes, nor use the same towel or comb, nor let their hands touch in giving or receiving. So a very cautious sense of discretion, decorum, respect with respect to the relationship between the genders. A sister-in-law and a brother-in-law do not interchange inquiries about each other, so no nosiness, no being a busybody. When they finished eating, so now it's the end of the meal, the guests will kneel in front of the mat and begin to remove the dishes and to give them to the attendant. So a good guest is going to offer to clean up, basically. The host, however, will then rise and decline this service from the guests, who will resume their seats. I mean, I guess I've seen people do that in our culture as well. You don't have to be Chinese and Confucian to operate that way. In any case, here's sort of the moral here. Always and in everything let there be reverence. With the deportment, how you act, grave, serious. As when one is thinking deeply, and with speech composed and definite. This, says Confucius, will make the people tranquil. And in a sense, that's the goal with all of these ways of acting, to develop a kind of inward and outward peace, a peace in one's heart, and a peaceful interrelationship with other people. Look at nothing in defiance of ritual, Li. Speak nothing in defiance of ritual. Never stir hand or foot in defiance of ritual. So that gives you a pretty good sense of what Confucius is all about here, a taste at least of his teaching on Li, or comportment. One other aspect, though, that I mentioned in Paths of Return is very, very important. Confucius believed that a peaceful society, a socially harmonious society in which people are acting in this way, deferentially, humbly, respectful of their place in society, is going to be affected very, very importantly by its music, by art in general, the arts in general, and by music in particular. Confucius did not think that art and beauty were simply subjective opinion. You've got your taste, I've got my taste. I like this style of music, you like that style of music. He believed beauty is not in the eye of the beholder, our common phrase. He believed it's objective. He believed that there is a universal harmony, proportion, and balance which some music captures and expresses to us, and which other music can't capture. It distorts and perverts it. I'm reminding you here also on this slide, way back at the beginning, I said, despite their external, outward differences, the perennialist at least claims the religions down deep on the inside all believe in the importance of four things at least: truth, right, virtue, beauty, prayer. And I talked about beauty as a configuration of God, if you're a Christian or a Muslim, or if you're a Jew, if you're Hindu, you believe in a God or the gods. In this case, it's not so much God as a person, but beauty is a configuration of a kind of heavenly pattern or template. I'll say more about that momentarily. But again, beauty is crucial, and music is especially important. Music, the vibrations of frequencies, tones, can have, again, either a positive or a negative effect on people's peace. Music expresses the harmony of the universe. Through harmony, all things are influenced, and through order, all things have a proper place. When rituals and music are well established, we have heaven and earth functioning in perfect order. I call your attention here, that's not Confucius himself, that's from a Confucian classic called the Li Qi. And in parenthesis there, I also call your attention to Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, who in his Republic, Book 3, also talks about the importance of certain tones or modes or sequences of sound having a particularly important effect on the soul. Well, finally, also here in this graphic on this side of the screen, I show you a musical scale and a keyboard. Confucius taught, and the Chinese really still, I think, practice this classically at least, that the pentatonic scale, the five-toned scale, was the best. The music that you could produce on a five-toned scale had the best effect on the vibrations, the inner resonance, the harmony of a person's soul. Well, I'm going to attempt to show you what this sounds like. So, C, D, E, G, A, G, E, C, D, C, excuse me. Now, if you hear a bit of the Orient in that, if you can get through my singing, it's no accident. Because again, this is the scale, the pentatonic scale, he called it, which was the best way of producing music, he thought, for the soul. If you want to try this sometime yourself, just hit all the black keys on a keyboard. So what I've got here, the C sharp, the D sharp, the F sharp, the G sharp, the A sharp, or the B flat, that's the pentatonic scale on a keyboard. What is this perfect order that I've put in red here? What does it mean for things to function in a perfect order? Well, socially, we're talking about what we've called the 5 constant relationships, the relationships between people in society. And as you'll remember from Paths of Return, these include the relationship between parents and children, between husband and wife, older sibling, younger sibling in a family, older friend, younger friend, and then finally the relationship between rulers and their subjects. As the slide says, the health of society depends on the careful observation of all these relations. Now, when this slide talks about health of society, what we're talking about in Chinese terms is this idea of de. Do you see T-E? It looks like te, I realize, but that'd be pronounced de in Chinese. I translated that in Paths of Return as moral force. We could also call it ethical energy. And I compared it to the flow of water, right, along an aqueduct, or the flow of blood in your circulatory system as the heart pumps the blood to all the body's extremities. Well, that flow, the flow of de, the flow of this ethical force or this energy, can only happen when one carefully observes the proper relationships between each of these sets of people, parent and child and so forth. The note on the slide is important. We've accentuated this as well in the lecture you read. All of these relations are unequal. There's no democracy here. There's no equality here. In each case we have, well, this slide says a superior and an inferior. All of us will be the superior in some cases and the inferior in other relationships. I don't like the word inferior. My little arrow says I would prefer to say subordinate. Inferior implies of poorer quality or not really worth as much. That's not what the Confucian is saying. He's not saying children aren't worth anything, or that a younger friend isn't as worth as much as his older friend, or that a wife is, to be put down and treated as inferior by her husband. Absolutely not. That's not the point. But it is a question, certainly, it is an issue of hierarchy in all these relationships. The Christian that might be surprised by this or think this is odd or maybe be a little bit put off by this notion of hierarchy, well, maybe should go back and read Paul, Colossians chapter 3, where I've got on the slide what I call a Christian equivalent of the Confucian hierarchy. Notice it's much the same. Wives, says Paul, submit yourselves to your husbands. as it is fit in the Lord. So Christ, the Lord, approves of this, wants this to happen, this kind of submission. But husbands, meanwhile, love your wives. Don't be bitter against them. Don't treat them bad. You should love them, care for them. Elsewhere, Paul talks about in Ephesians, the husband should love the wife as much as Christ loves his church and is willing to sacrifice himself for her. So it's not authoritarianism, but there is hierarchy. Similarly, children, obey your parents in all things. This is also well-pleasing unto the Lord. Fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. So again, it's a two-way street. Kids, obey dad, but dad, don't beat up on the kids. Don't provoke them. Servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. But at the same time, two-way street, masters, give unto your servant that which is just and equal, knowing, now talking to the master, we could say in Confucian terms, talking to the ruler, knowing that ye also have a master in heaven. So even the top person in the Confucian hierarchy, namely the ruler of the society, the king or the emperor, right, also has a superordinate. He or she herself, himself, is subordinate to something else, namely heaven itself. The Confucian talks about the mandate of heaven and says even the ruler is subject to something, not subject to another human person while he's the ruler, but he's still subject to the mandate of heaven. And the key principles here, I mentioned these in Paths of Return, are that the power to rule, the authority to rule, the rightful authority to rule, is granted only by heaven, while the right to rule is based on the virtue of a given ruler. Confucius says in the Analects, and I quote, if the ruler himself is upright, in other words, righteous, noble, moral, ethical, treating people fairly, all will go well, even though he doesn't give any orders. But if he himself is not upright, if he's not himself subject to the mandate of heaven, even though he gives orders, they will not be obeyed. And as I said in the lecture you read, they shouldn't be obeyed. That's a time, in fact, for revolution, says Confucius. Now, heaven, the asterisk next to heaven at the top of the slide coming down to the bottom. Confucius, like the Buddha, did not talk about God in a personal way. So the Analects says the topics the master, Confucius, did not speak of included prodigies, that is to say miracles, and the gods. He didn't talk about gods. So what is heaven? What is heaven in this context? Well, heaven, I come back to Plato again. Plato, I think, expresses this well. Once again, the Republic, I referred to that earlier, when he talks about there being, quote, a pattern set up in heaven, as it were in the cosmos itself, for one who desires to see it, and who, seeing that pattern, is able then to found, Plato says, a just commonwealth. Now notice this interestingly, within himself. So the whole social network, in fact, is really present within each of us inwardly in a kind of intimate, I'll call it microcosmic way, while at the same time that pattern, that harmony, is meant to reflect something cosmic in character, macrocosmic in character. So this is what's going on when Confucius talks about heaven. Not a particular God, but a kind of, I don't know what to call it here, an impersonal cosmic template. The ruler himself must be subject to that, must be in obedience to that. Now, for much of China's history, that ruler was, in fact, a king, an emperor. Traditionally, the Chinese emperor lived here in the imperial palace inside what's called the Forbidden City in Beijing. The question comes up sometimes. I've been asked this before by students. Well, there's no Chinese emperor now. So how do contemporary 21st century Confucians understand this idea of the mandate of heaven? And how do they, make sense of the relationship to it if they live in a society where no one's the ruler in this sense, in the ancient sense of that term? What if you live in a communist country like mainland China or in a democracy like Taiwan? where no one is the king, no one is emperor, no one has been acknowledged to have authority over the whole of society. Well, the Confucian answer, as I understand it at least, is that they relate the idea of mandate of heaven to each of us as individuals, rather than to a whole society or a political regime. And they often quote the opening line of another classic Confucian text called The Doctrine of the Mean. The Doctrine of the Mean. And the text says, and I quote, "The mandate of heaven is known as nature. Accordance with nature is known as the way. And cultivation of that way is known as instruction." Instruction here, a translation of Li. So the word nature now takes the place of heaven. And you see what's going on here, I hope at least. Heaven, again, is more like a pattern, a cosmic pattern. And what we're talking about when we talk about nature is the almost ecological, environmental harmony of things in the natural world, the seasons, the passage of the days, the interaction between plants and animals, the Krebs cycle, the way in which water comes from the sky and then evaporates and is taken up into clouds, and you have the water cycle and rain, and so all of that's nature, all of that's the harmony and the mandate of heaven, as it's understood at least now in contemporary times by Confucians. And that's what we should all in some way be subject to. We should all be acting in accordance with that ultimate pattern insofar as we can. If we do so, society will go well. If we don't, well, it won't. Another idea that we described in Paths of Return, a key idea for Confucian, is the term Ren. Now, don't ask me about transliteration. I don't know. The Wade-Giles system of transliteration, it's spelled with a J. I know that looks like Jen, but it's pronounced as Ren. As I mentioned, it's the pronunciation in Chinese of this particular ideogram, this character in Chinese, which is meant to represent a person. So I guess that's your torso, and here's a leg. But not just one person. When you write that, which means human being, and the next to it have these two horizontal lines, that means two people. Two people in relationship to each other. Ren, translated into English as true humanity, sometimes compassion, benevolence, kindness. I like the word empathy. What Ren is deep down is relation between two people who are so in tune with each other that their hearts beat as one. That's the imagery that I used in Paths of Return. Well, that's Ren. That's the virtue the Confucian is seeking to acquire. I ask you here to recall the first of the 5 Buddhist precepts, which was, well, not simply don't murder, don't kill, but don't show any violence toward anyone, including toward animals. Well, that's kind of tied up with this idea of Ren for Confucianism. As I mentioned, Ren is to be sought first of all with respect to at least one other person. So letting go of our ego, stepping outside of our egotism, giving somebody else pride of place, showing deference toward at least one other person. And then as it expands, my little circles, concentric circles, are meant to show the expansion of Ren. Then we have to work against nepotism, which is preferring our families, racism, which is preferring those of our race or our ethnic group, nationalism, preferring our nation. Finally, Ren expands out to the point that we show empathy, kindness, benevolence, compassion toward other than human beings. We get rid of our anthropocentrism and act sympathetically toward the animals and the natural world around us. That's the ideal for Confucianism. That's what we're seeking to acquire as we submit ourselves in all these constant relationships and then ultimately to the archetypes or the pattern of heaven itself. Christian equivalents to this idea. Rejoice, Paul says, with them that do rejoice. Weep with them that weep. Be of the same mind one toward another. Live in harmony with one another. That's, ladies and gentlemen, that's Christian Ren. That's the same thing Confucius is seeking. And then also a second quotation from the Gospel of Mark, where Christ says, love your neighbor as yourself. I'm playing a little bit here. Notice how I spelled yourself as two words. And I said in parenthesis, it's not just love your neighbor as yourself, which could mean, do to your neighbor what you want them to do to you, or love them as if they are yourself, but of course they're not. No, love your neighbor as being your very self. Love your neighbor insofar as your neighbor is intimately, organically so united with you that there's finally no difference between you and your neighbor. It's one self. That's Confucian Ren as well, if you want to read it that way and emphasize things as I just did in that text in Mark. The person who's able to do this, to reach this high standard of empathy toward all living beings, in Chinese, in Confucianism, is called the Chunzi. The Chunzi. Literally, that means the Lord's Son, and it refers to someone who is superior, exemplary, magnanimous. These are all ways of translating the Chunzi, the superior, the exemplary, the model human being, the paragon, the magnanimous person. Well, that's the Chunzi. You could simply say, to plug it into the other saintly figures that we're talking about this semester, Chunzi is the Chinese word for the saint. The saint in Confucius' understanding, however, is not a miracle worker, not, sort of like the Jivan Mukta, who has all of these extraordinary paranormal abilities. No, the saint has simplicity, self-effacement, transparency, and a kind of, if you permit me this paradox, an extraordinary ordinariness. Quotation from a Chinese text. A disciple asked about the Chunzi. The master, that's Confucius, of course, said in response, well, the Chunzi does not preach what he practices till he has practiced what he preaches. He's calm and at ease, while the small-minded person is fretful and ill at ease. The demands the Chunzi makes are on himself. Those that a small-minded person makes are on others. The ways of the Chunzi are three. I myself, Confucius says humbly, have met with success in none of them. For the Chunzi that is really good is never unhappy. He that is really wise, never perplexed. He that is really brave is never afraid. And this is an interesting conclusion, right? The disciple says, that, master, is truly your way. So the disciple, the student, recognizes that Confucius has in fact mastered this high calling. But Confucius himself is too humble, too simple, too self-effacing to say so. He says, no, I'm not even close to that yet. Notice how in all of this discussion, how many challenges there are from the traditional Chinese point of view to our status quo, the way we understand things today in our culture, the contemporary Western culture we live in. We've already talked about how different the hierarchical social vision is from our democratic vision of egalitarian rights, how it is that I'll call it the communitarianism of Confucianism differs from our individualism. There's also the stress on old age. I've not talked about that here, but I mentioned it in Paths of Return versus our very youth-oriented culture. The Confucius says he's a traditionalist. He never tries to make anything up. He just borrows from others. Imitation, you see, here is a virtue for Confucius. We say, oh, no. You have to be novel. You have to be original. And then, of course, also vis-a-vis the arts and music, Confucius says there is an objective beauty. There is a right way of arranging things in a painting or arranging tones, frequencies in a piece of music. And we say, no, it's all just subjective. It's our preference. It's, different strokes for different folks. We have different tastes in things. That's completely rejected by the Confucian paradigm. And then in terms of, so that's contemporary Western dissonance between us and Confucius. In terms of the traditional Western religions, a pretty big difference here also, in as much as Confucius focuses on how we act, what I call here orthopraxy, right practice, right ethical moral relation with others, how you behave. Whereas we in the West, especially Christians, I would say, tend to stress it's how you believe, what you think, that makes you right or wrong, your orthodoxy. your beliefs, your doctrines, your teachings, and so forth. That's really what's focused on often in the Christian traditional West. And then, of course, finally, a big dissonance here between a religion that stresses an impersonal, I called it an impersonal cosmic template, versus a religion, and this would be Islam, Judaism, Christianity, all the Western religions, which talk about a personal God. All this raises questions. I'm going to leave you with this. I'm not going to answer these questions, but I want you to ponder them, think about them. What exactly do you think a religion adds to ethics? So some people say Confucianism is just an ethical system. It's not really a religion at all. Well, does that make any difference? Does a religion, as we understand it in the West, really add anything, or is ethics just fine? What does a personal God add to a concept of heaven, if anything? Does it add something, or is a cosmic pattern sufficient for having a worthy spiritual calling? Can a person be good who has no belief in God? Well, I think Confucius would say so. Would you say so? And then finally, is virtue, and everybody thinks virtue is important, truth, virtue, beauty, prayer, all the religions insist upon those. Is virtue, though, how do you understand virtue and good moral, ethical, righteous behavior? Is it a means to an end? Do you act in a really kind way to other people just to get a reward? And if so, is it really virtue? Is virtue an end in itself? Is acting kindly and deferentially and empathetically toward other beings, that's all there is? Or should there be a reward? Or is virtue irrelevant to one's final destiny? I mean, there are religions, maybe not, well, not whole religions, certainly, but there are religious people, I know at least, you probably know them as well, who would say, it's not really how you act. We're all sinners. Nobody can really be righteous. It's just having faith. It's just trusting in God. And, virtue or not, God will reward you for your faith. Is that how you look at this? So important questions arise in talking about discussing a religion like Confucianism. And I encourage you, to think about these. Take these seriously. Take a long walk in the woods and think about them sometime.